You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Hello everyone, welcome back to episode 216 of Arsenal Pass. Hayden Dale here with Pankaj Bhojwani as always. This week on the pod, we are talking Classic Constructed with High Seas. There is a lot that's about to happen and things about to kick off in this new Classic Constructed meta with US Nationals and Calling Vegas this weekend. But we're also going to take a look in about how the landscape might change drastically over the next couple of weeks with so many heroes close to Living Legend and a national season ready to dish out a lot of points, all that and more coming in the main topic of the pod. But first of all, Pankaj, how are you and how was your week in Flesh and Blood or in life?
I'm doing really well, Hayden. Thanks for adding the in life at the end there, because as you know, I didn't get a lot of fab time this past week. I had a friend visiting. They're staying on the West Coast right now, but they're moving to the East Coast soon. So they're just doing a little trip alongside a bunch of their friends on the West Coast. So unfortunately, couldn't even attend a pre-release because they got in Friday evening and then they left Monday morning. So did a bunch of Pacific Northwest stuff. You know, we went to Mount Rainier, the national park there, and like did some hikes and hung out and stuff. So it was great on the live front, but I'm feeling a little bit behind going into the casting gig for US Nat, so I need to spend the next few days definitely catching up. At the time of recording, this is Tuesday, so US Nats is happening this coming weekend. So people definitely should tune into that. But I know you managed to attend some pre-releases. How did those go?
Yeah, I mean, you've got plenty of time, so you'll be okay. And this format, I think, is people are learning so much day on day, and it's going to evolve when it comes to Classic Constructed. And honestly, Draft, actually, which is quite interesting. I did a couple of pre-releases over the weekend and quite a fair number of drafts, actually, in-person drafts. Got to do a couple of those, which was great. I think the set is honestly fantastic for Draft, and people are just really excited to play it. Interestingly, I actually think this format, the sealed format, is so good. It honestly might be pretty close to Draft. Like, I think in past formats, you know, the sealed has been close to unplayable in some of these formats, or just very one-dimensional and not very good. I think the seal format is very good, and it's not far away from the draft format, to be honest. They've fixed a lot of things with draft. I think they've still got a ways to go with some of the things in the actual draft itself, but in terms of how you can potentially stay open, the cards you pick up, the way the games play out I think are great. I think obviously we spoke about it in the review pod for Limited. Treasure Island just makes such a massive difference in the way that the games play out. So yeah, enjoyed my pre-releases. Got to play all three heroes, I think, over the pre-release weekend, a couple of times in draft for Puffin, for instance. So yeah, no, it was a good weekend.
I've definitely heard that sentiment with regards to draft, and for once, Twitter is actually being super, super positive about Limited for High Seas, so that's great to see.
Yeah, definitely.
That sealed take is something that I haven't heard too much of. So you think there isn't like a particular hero you should default to? Like Rosetta had like Florian, right? You just default to Florian in Rosetta sealed. Do you think that's not the case in High Seas?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I probably need to play it a little bit more, but I think the fact that we haven't gone through World Premiere, like by the end of World Premiere, I was like, yeah, you like, for instance, when I went to Tokyo for Part of the Misfire, I was like, yeah, you should basically just be either playing, like, I thought it was like news unplayable. I was like, you should basically be playing Zen effectively, or if you have the right illusionist cards, you can play illusionist. And then I think for, you know, Rosetta and the Hunted, I think that kind of played out to a degree as well in terms of it being a little bit more solved, even week 1, week 2 in of the seal format. I think this one, because of, again, like 8 packs, but of course just how strong the pirate cards are and how your deck revolves around blues and the interaction between like second cycle, I think it's quite interesting. I think there's a world where, honestly, I think maybe Marlin becomes like the default, but I don't think it's as clear cut as maybe it has been in other formats, so I think it's quite cool.
That is awesome to hear. Did you pull anything good from your packs?
Did I pull anything good? No, unfortunately, no, I didn't. I did, if you saw, I did a box break on the World Premiere stream, and I did open a Polycranker, which is quite cool. So that was nice, but no, otherwise nothing good this weekend.
Very on brand for you, though, that pull, a legendary pull. We'll get more into the CC, but I know you have been brewing with Puffin, and I'm very, very curious to hear your takes on it.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
I'm sure that hopefully that Polycranker comes in useful for you.
Yeah, maybe. We'll get into that. Before then, let's talk about the news. Not a lot to cover in the news this week, but Vegas, US Nats, and the calling happening this weekend. Our friend here, Pankaj, is going to be on that cast. He's going to be streaming and covering that event. So go check it out on YouTube, FabTCG YouTube page. Follow along with all the coverage. I know I will be doing that. I'm interested to see what this first look at Classic Constructed looks like. I'm also really interested to see how some players actually tackle draft now we're a couple of weeks in terms of strategy and things like that. Limited has definitely been my focus because I'm not playing Nationals this year, which I just spoke to Pankaj about earlier. I am having a clash, unfortunately, and I'm not playing Nationals this year, but I am playing Singapore, which comes 2 weeks after my Nationals anyway. So I'm going to have the same approach prepping for either event, is that I'm going to focus on Limited these next couple of weeks, and then I'm going to pivot to Classic Constructed because the format is just going to evolve so quickly, and we have so many questions about which heroes will actually be legal by the time we get to Singapore. So yeah, my focus is more so on Limited, but I mean, I love playing Classic Constructed, so interested to see what decks might be out there, if someone going to bring a Gravy, things like this, so we're going to see a breakout. We'll get into that main topic of the pod. The other thing we didn't touch on last week because of the fact that we did the Limited set review, go check it out if you haven't already. I think one of our finest, if I do say so myself, Pankaj. I think we really got into it. And honestly, I was playing over the weekend at pre-release, and I was like, yeah, I think we got a lot of these grades right, honestly, like majority of them. There was a couple where I was like, yeah, maybe I would revisit on this, but I think the way after playing in the world premiere or playing at the world premiere anyway and understanding it, I think kind of played out. But we missed talking about the ban and restricted announcement, which is a massive, massive thing. I assume by now that everyone listening has heard this, but maybe you haven't. So we will cover it off quickly because it does have implication for what we talk about in the main topic of the pod around Classic Constructed, Meta 4 High Seas and this national season. But Count Your Blessings is fully banned out the door. Germinate has been banned with a promise of a card that kind of semi-replaces it, or there's at least a reason why this card had to be banned. If you haven't seen it already, is of course the one that puts a card to the bottom of the deck. Scepter of Pain is completely gone. Big part of the reasoning for this was around similar to the fact that Kraken's Aether Vein, AMP just wasn't around when Scepter of Pain was designed, and then Bonds of Ancestry Red is unbanned, but not yellow and blue, potentially giving some reprieve to Katsu, and there's a whole host of Living Legend and Blitz changes, which we won't get into right now because they're not relevant to what we're going to talk about, but go check it out if you want to on fabtcg.com. Pankaj, what was your initial reaction?
Okay, well, first thing, real quick on your Australian Nats thing.
Yeah.
I'm super bummed that you can't make it to Australian Nats. I hope you have fun in your other commitment, obviously.
Thank you.
But Australian Nats with no Hayden Dale top 8 is, I think, going to be a bit of a bummer. Although I'm sure the competitors down there are going to be celebrating, though, without one of the premier players in the region not playing. So, they're going to be able to... some new faces we'll get up there. Next thing, real quick about the limited set review, that actually gave me an idea. I think next time, every time we disagree on a grade, every time we have a grade that's maybe one full grade level different from each other, we should actually note it down.
Yes.
And then
see who's right.
revisit it afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then revisit it afterwards, because I actually think the past 2 times we had certain cards which we disagreed on, and then we never noted it down. So for next time, we have to make sure we note it down.
I can think of a couple off the top of my
yes.
head. I can think of I know Goldwing Turbine was one off the top of my head.
Goldwing Turbine was
yeah.
Yeah. Coming back to BNR. So actually, I did discuss this with Nathan when he guested with us 2 weeks ago, because you were off in Taipei
of course
doing
you
the world
did.
premiere.
Of course you did. Sorry.
Yes. Yes. So that was a discussion on the pod that week. So definitely go check out that episode if you haven't already. But in terms of my initial takes, I'm glad CYB is banned. We had this conversation a couple of weeks before when we knew the BNR was coming, where I said I was coping and predicting the CYB would be banned, but in a sort of, not because it's egregious power level wise, but just because of a flavor. And to be honest, the BNR, the article itself did also echo that. It was like, it's not out of the power level, allowed power level.
Yeah.
It's just, it was a miserable player experience. Actually, yeah, and the article covered more on miserable player experience. I was thinking more on flavor standpoint, but in any case, I'm glad it's gone. Scepter of Pain was interesting. We brought this up. Nathan and I discussed this a little bit, where it was interesting because this one and Kraken's Aether Vein were clearly worded to one day have support.
I know.
For weapons being buffed. But in the moment the support came, they're like, oh, okay, cool, we got to get rid of this now. And I think our conclusion was they weren't expecting the level of AMP that would potentially be allowed when they designed those cards to begin with. Because these cards came out in Everfest, right? That was forever ago. And they weren't expecting AMP 3 in the form of Millennium Tree, or in Verdance's case, AMP Infinite, right?
Yeah.
Basically. So those cards had to go. Bonds being unbanned, I'm happy for the Katsu fans. I think at this point, some exploration is happening with the hero already. I think he is definitely better than he used to be. I think he has some inconsistency issues, but I don't think you're trolling if you want to play Katsu. But yeah, I think there's probably a better ninja that you could play. And then Germinate, Germinate being banned. This was, I guess, when we were discussing it, we hadn't seen Everbloom yet. It's interesting. Everbloom, I don't know, Germinate does feel stronger than Everbloom in Florence specifically.
It's infinitely stronger.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm super happy about Everbloom coming in for Verdance reasons.
Of course.
Blue
Yeah.
non-attack block 3. Those are my super quick thoughts. What were yours?
I just love this. That's the kind of joke, right? Of like, they took away one of the best cards in Florian and gave Verdance a new card. Basically.
So I haven't actually heard your thoughts on this, and actually none of the listeners have. Obviously, they've heard me and Nathan rant about it. So you tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, so my predictions beforehand was that we were going to get a hit to Florian. We did speak about Germinate actually as a potential hit. I also spoke about, I thought it was going to be Reaping Blade if a weapon. I did think a weapon. I actually thought they were going to. I spoke about Cedar of Pain, but thought Reaping Blade was potentially more likely, just because of the fact that the life gain element. But then, of course, they've banned out Count Your Blessing as well, and the AMP conversation. It makes sense. We spoke about Count Your Blessing. So Count Your Blessing I wasn't surprised about. I think ultimately it's fine. Like, I think I would have been fine either way. I don't have a strong feeling. I think, to me, I'm like, yeah, I feel like it should be in the game, but if it's going to cause more problems than it's worth, they also cited the fact that it's a challenge for internal testing and development purposes, and they spoke about that on last week's Dev Talk as well, which if you haven't checked out that Dev Talk is, sorry Brian and James, but that might be my favorite Dev Talk, because it was like the kids are at home while Brian and James were overseas, and it was quite funny between the three of them there, with Kieran, Jason, and Uyong, I think. But yeah, I think the Germinate ban, it's fine. I get it. It's a very powerful card. I think citing Flourishing, is it called Nourishing Bloom? Flourishing Bloom? Whatever it's called. The new card. Everbloom, sorry.
Everbloom, right?
I don't buy it. I don't think that's the reason, because I don't actually think that's crazy powerful. I think it's maybe a little, like, having loops like that is not good for the game, but I don't think that's the entire reason. I think Germinate is just powerful and you had to hit Florian, otherwise the deck is just insane. And then I think Verdance is like by far and away the biggest winner out of this ban suspended announcement, I think, and also getting the new Earth card. That's kind of why I say that, because Germinate goes and they get the Earth card. And Bonds of Ancestry Red got me super hyped up about Katsu again. Lots of new cards printed over the last 2 years. I've had a go. I'm not a believer. I think there's some real consistency problems, and it just feels a bit too clunky for me. But yeah.
I would say Nu is actually the other big winner.
Oh yeah,
from the Florian being hit as well. Especially if Verdance comes up, I think Nu is a pretty good, has a decent matchup into Verdance. Yeah. The Scepter of Pain was actually particularly interesting. I remember seeing that, and it reminded me of something you were saying in the weeks leading up to it, was that even in your Scepter Florian build, you were having more and more matchups where you were just bringing Reaping Blade anyway. Yeah. So I was like, oh, how much is this actually doing? Yeah. So that was interesting. Now, there was something else in the announcement, which I definitely want your take on, since you will presumably actually be competing in Worlds. We sort of glossed over the LL changes, and we won't go over it now again. If you need to know the LL changes, go check out the article again. But Hayden, they announced LL will be a part of Worlds.
It's part of the team event, though,
right? No.
Oh, really?
That's not what it implied. I'm pretty sure it implied sort of like how the first Worlds had Blitz. Instead of Blitz, it'll be LL. That was my read on it.
Interesting. Okay. Because I actually was trying to follow this up, and I went to see if there was a event page for the World Championships yet, but there isn't. There's just a blocked out piece. So, yeah, I guess if that is the case, and LL is going to be used as a third format, or there's also speculation that maybe no draft for Worlds, because...
Oh, or maybe just one draft? Maybe it's one draft and then the others.
Because of also, I think, is there another draftable set that comes out before World Championships?
That almost, yes, there definitely is. There's the September one, right? There's one that comes out in September.
Oh, you're right. That's and that's a draftable set, right? I think there was a speculation is that a draftable set or is that another non-draft? But they've moved away from that. They're all draftable now, except for these mastery packs, I think. So, and it would make sense to have a world premiere if it wasn't limited playable. So yeah, okay, that makes sense. So I guess it's going to be 3 formats.
Yeah. So I will just quote from the article. Living Legend will be one of the formats used to determine our world champion.
Oh, okay.
So it's not just team everything; it's to determine the world champion. So yeah. So you will.
I don't know, man.
How do you feel about that?
I've just got PTSD from Worlds 1 and being undone by Blitz by going 2-5 and losing 2/3 win-ins for Worlds, man. And Blitz for top 8.
Losing to Rhinar, no less, which is like your hero.
Also, yeah, Prison before that as well. I don't know. I like the balance of. I personally think draft is really important to have at Worlds, and I like that they have 2 drafts and they split it. I know that's a real. There's a real sort of mix of feelings on that one. Split, sort of polarizing that one a little bit. I think introducing a 3rd format though is. I think I don't hate it, but I also don't love it. And the reason I don't necessarily love it is because when do people play this format right now? Like, I just worry that we're kind of forcing Living Legend into the space of putting it in front of people by creating a calling sometime in the year and then all of a sudden having Living Legend be a part of Worlds. I'm like, do people actually play this format? And I think that's probably my one concern is it necessary? Honestly, but if they have a sort of view of how they're going to use Living Legend for more things at a store level and all the way through, so from, of course, it's a format for skirmishes this season. Fine, no worries. And then but I want to see a ProQuest season then if they're going to do that. I think Living Legend then has to be a ProQuest season format at some point.
Yeah, it is. That's what the article says as well. Yes.
Good.
Yeah. So it'll be format's first inclusion in a ProQuest season coming up.
So assume that's going to be for PT1 next year. So post World Premier, post World Championships, the ProQuest season falls in the back half of. Oh no, it's actually October, isn't it? It's before Worlds, isn't it? The way it falls now.
It should be before Worlds.
Yeah. So we'll see Living Legend.
Because usually post Worlds is like nothing. So,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so you'll have time to practice the format.
That makes sense.
I imagine there'll be other callings and battle hardens at Living Legend as well.
Okay, I don't hate that then. I don't hate that. Yeah.
I'm curious about where it will take the place. Like, are they going to eat into CC? Are they going to eat into draft? I think that is the very, very important thing that we need to know.
What did they do for the first? They ate into CC effectively because you still had World Champs 1 was it was 5 rounds of CC, 6 rounds of draft, and then 5 rounds. It was 16 rounds. It was 5 of the 2 classic constructed and 6 rounds of draft.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So
true.
Depends. Maybe, like you say, maybe it's just one draft. I think that's a real. So we spoke a few weeks ago about how LSS sort of use limited going forward, right? I can't remember if we spoke about this in the main pod or Patreon, but we spoke about how they use limited going forward, and we said, are they going to take a step back in limited? And I think after the set, they don't need to. Like, if this is the quality of their limited formats going forward, I think they should be doing the opposite. Make this as exciting as possible. Get people to understand that, hey, we've addressed some concerns with the limited format. This format is fun. And start to push it more. I guess the challenge is, does it translate at a casual level? That's just always the challenge with limited.
From what we know about LSS, I don't think limited is going anywhere in I hope not. Premier competitive play. At least, okay, it's definitely not going completely. And yeah, I find it hard to believe that they would remove one draft, just given how much effort they put into the draft formats. I mean, I think, okay, I don't want to misquote, but I believe I heard them saying that the limited design and development takes the same amount of development resources as CC does. So it's like literally like half and half. So I find it, I struggle to believe they would take away like one whole draft to do it. But then that means they're eating into CC, and then that also feels strange. I think if there's more CC, if it's like 6 draft rounds, but only 5 CC rounds, I do feel like that maybe feels a little strange. So we'll have to wait and see and see how they do the thing. I mean, I don't think. I mean, it might not even be 5 Living Legend games, right? Like maybe it's 3 or 4, and then that means they don't eat away that much from CC potentially.
Yeah, 4. At that point, I'm like, I think 3. You're at the point of like, is this even worth it? But 4, I think. Yeah, 4 or 5. Yeah, be interesting to see. Interesting to see.
All right. Moving on to the command and cookout. This week's question comes from Sigma Chaos Brute from Discord. How will Ranger play like when Death Dealer is gone and considering high seas? Will the builds start being more complicated or intricate given Sandscour and Hammerhead are powerful but hard to play / build with? Or will they lean more aggro and Dreadbore be the go-to bow more often than not? My take on this is that I think it really depends on the Ranger. Riptide will continue to be unplayable, and Marlin will be between Hammerhead and Manta. I think there's probably two... I think there's two sort of builds of Marlin that are coming up. There's the Hammerhead Cannon build, and then there's like the Manta build. So I think those two builds will continue to exist, and Riptide will, I guess he'll play Dreadbore, but like there's no point playing him.
Why does Marlin want to play Manta over Death Dealer?
Oh, this is the question is post.
I know, but you spoke earlier about a potential Manta build, and my question is like Redline has been around for a very long time and not seen play in Azalea or Lexi or any of these other ranges. So why now with Manta? Right. I guess is my question.
Because I believe again it's the builds for Marlin are definitely in the early stages.
For sure.
Here's my take on it. New Horizon doesn't work nicely with Death Dealer because Death Dealer needs your arsenal to be empty for you to load anything. Whereas Red Spine, you can slap a face-up arrow and still go ahead and load. And then now you might ask why New Horizon? Well, New Horizon's really good with 3 of a kind. So to have New Horizon and 3 of a kind, sometimes Death Dealer can be clunky. Sometimes. And so Manta is a potential exploration. I would say it's in the exploration state right now. And there are reasons to play it over Death Dealer. And it's got to do with the way New Horizon 3 of a kind work in Marlin.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think the reason I chose this question specifically is because I know you've been playing some Marlin with Cannon, and Sandscour is really interesting to me. I think that weapon is powerful, but it's the reason I think Azalea played it in patches is just consistency. Like you play a game against Sandscour Azalea and you're like, this deck feels broken, and then you play the next game and you're like, does this deck even do anything? So I feel like that is a big part of it when you have Death Dealer as a more consistent option. But once Death Dealer goes, it opens up, right? It becomes interesting to me. But of course that means also Azalea's gone. I don't think Sandscour is the weapon for Marlin, personally, just from what I'm seeing so far. I think it is, to your point. I think it's a case of being a Manta or a Hammerhead, I think is what I'm hoping. That was super exciting to me if it's Hammerhead. I think when it comes to Riptide, the problem is, so Dreadbore, right, is an interesting weapon for counterplay. The problem I have with Dreadbore is it's not inherently a powerful weapon. It doesn't do something that helps you push the power of your hero, and of course that's what Death Dealer did, right? It drew you a card. Like that's a really powerful ability. Cannon, gives you potential overpower and gives you damage on a weapon, right? So it's really interesting. And then Manta lets you play things like load your arrows for free, right? So it's not super powerful, but it has flexibility, like you spoke about. And Dreadbore just kind of exists and has this kind of looming threat. But then what happens is you play against it. And if the opponent sideboards hedges against you potentially having Dreadbore, they're usually okay because they're like, well, I'll just play some of these from Arsenal, I'll pitch some of them. You're playing a weapon that's so much worse that I can afford to pitch this red defense reaction to pay a cost because you're already IPing, or effectively losing value on your weapon. So I can afford to lose some value on this card that I can't play. So yeah, that's kind of my view. I think it's going to be interesting to see. I kind of agree. Riptide feels like it's not going to be in a good spot. And Marlin, I'm not sure at this stage. Honestly, these new heroes are just so deep that I think we're just scratching the surface right now of what they could be.
The +1 on Dreadbore is quite nice with bolt and shot stuff.
Yeah,
but the
true.
problem is the bolt and shot stuff doesn't work well with the rest of like what the Dreadbore build wants to do. So there's a lot of anti-synergy there going on. And also, I mean, I've said this before, I believe, on the pod. I'm going to say it again. I just don't think Riptide has a weapon right now, and that's part of why he's very unplayable. Like, Barbed Castaway is really... He needs a better Barbed Castaway.
Exactly.
Like a CC playable Barbed Castaway. Barbed Castaway is for limited. Give him a CC version of it, and then he's playable. Maybe. Thing is, he's still a trap-based deck, and Gravy Bones is in the meta, so... or at least, is probably going to show up, and it's going to be weird, potentially. But yeah, he needs a better Barbed Castaway, and then I actually think he might be playable.
Yeah, give me Thorned Castaway. That's what I want. I agree. I really like Barbed Castaway. I think the designers are really cool, in terms of that modality of what it does, but it needs something, just a little bit of oomph. And then I agree, I would be right there, because I every time I've looked at Riptide and I have a bit of a breakdown of it, what stands out to me is that Barbed Castaway is the correct weapon to play, but it's just not good enough. It's just not good enough, and that's the problem.
Yeah, you need the aim counter stuff, and you can't flip up traps. It's all real orcs. It does feel like a lot of the Ranger cards just have these stipulations and these restrictions on them again and again, and kind of just like you're playing around with it, like this is just very clunky. There's sometimes where it comes together, to your point, right? Like the Sandscour Azalea. Sometimes where it comes together and you're like, this is smooth, this is insane. And then there's other times where it's all just working against each other. It's like always inherent anti-synergy in all the Ranger cards. It gets a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, and I understand they've got to be careful. Voltaire was a hell of a weapon, right? And they've obviously want to be careful about that. But that was also paired with the fact that Lexi's hero ability was also really good. So I think there's some checks and balances there.
And a big part of Lexi's hero ability was that she had unconditional flip. She can flip up anything, which was huge. And then she had Voltaire on top of it. I'm just like, I want more unconditional flip. It's just so annoying that Barbed Castaway is like, you can only flip up an arrow. Marlin's like Sarong is you can only flip up blue arrows, and it's also, it just makes everything so awkward.
Agree. Well, great question there. If you want to get your questions in for the Commander Cookout, please do so. You can either drop a question on the YouTube comments here if you're a video watcher, if you're an audio listener. If you're on Spotify, you can actually drop a comment into the Spotify comments. I am now checking those, if you do want to drop a Spotify comment in there. I'm not checking any other platform other than YouTube and Spotify, though. If you're a Discord, Patreon, like Sigma is, you can drop them into our Commander Cookout section on the Discord. You can also send us an email, arsenalpassfab@gmail.com, or give us a note in person like people have done over the last few events. I'm looking for someone to give Pankaj a nice question this weekend in Vegas. With that all said, let's get into what the Classic Constructor meta might look like for Vegas and also in the weeks ahead. And I want to set the scene, Pankaj, with the Living Legend landscape, because things are going to evolve, and they're going to evolve rapidly, potentially, over the next couple of weeks. And the reason I'll say potentially is this. We sit now with 3 heroes over 900 Living Legend points, which means that all 3 of these heroes, between a Nationals and a Calling win, either both, for the case of Azalea, or one for either Nu of Dash, would send them off into the sunset with the Living Legend points that are now on offer for these heroes. So Azalea is now sitting at 931 Living Legend points. Nu is at 954, and Dash is at 976. But behind them is also Fi on 800, Kano on 790. So Kano could technically Living Legend this national season. We'll talk about how powerful Kano may or may not be. Then I think we start to get into things that are a little bit less relevant. Bravo at 770, KO at 740. Although we'll talk about KO a little bit. Florian at 700, though, is certainly very relevant there. So I do just want to point that out. I also want to talk about the Living Legend changes. Of course, there is a change in the Living Legend point system. So for US Nationals, 50 points on offer for winning the event, which is the same as a Calling, 50 points. Pro Tour and World Championships are 100 points. Battle Harden's 25. Some of these smaller nationals, just to point out, a cap of 24 to 32. So these very small nationals that only awards 5 points. 64 to 80, which is your sort of generally medium-sized nationals for a lot of countries, 10 points. And then your sort of your UKs, your Australias, your Canadas, your 96 to 160 player cap, that's 25 points, so half of US nationals. But there has now been introduced by Legend Story Studios a Living Legend points modifier or multiplier depending on time of legality. And just to simplify it, effectively, if the hero is within 1 year of its release date, they'll only receive half of the allocated Living Legend points that would go to them. So if you won US Nationals, but you are, say, Florian, for instance, you will only receive 25 points towards Living Legend. So Florian, very unlikely, I think, a lot less likely to Living Legend through this national season. If you're 1 to 2 years out there, you're going to get exactly 1 point, so 1 modifier. So that's your Nu's, for instance. Nu is now more than a year from release, so it's going to get exactly the points that you would get. And then if you're 2+ years out, Azalea, looking at you, Bravo, I'm not so much looking at you, honestly, but 1.5 times the amount of points. So if Azalea does win US Nationals, it's going to get 75 points, which is going to send Azalea into Living Legend. So I stand corrected. Calling or a Nationals win will actually, just by itself, send Azalea onto Living Legend. And I think the other one that's interesting is if heroes like Fi, Kano, etc. Like Kano, I honestly think Kano could Living Legend this national season, which is very interesting.
I could see it too. I think people are looking at Kano. I think Arcane Compliance is a card that is shooting a little bit up in demand, just sort of more like just in like preparation potentially for the Kano thing. Also important to point out about the multiplier is that now in the back end, they will actually track fractional LL points.
Oh, right.
So we won't have the case where they keep rounding up and down, which means... Remember, we spoke about this quite a bit on the pod, where each Pro Quest the past season ended up being 3 points each, even though it should have been like 2.5 something or something, and that ended up meaning that there were a lot more LL points on the line than was ideal for a season. I think they want 1,500 per season, but there ended up being more than that because of the rounding error. But this time there will be no more rounding. So when a hero gets 0.5 times or 1.5 times, they will actually get those amounts. You know what this reminds me of, Hayden? Before London, there was the whole conversation around Zen's dubiousness of being legal for the Pro Tour a week before the event. And I really wanted your opinion on it as a player, but you were casting it. And now we are again in that spot for Nationals happening after US Nationals, where they don't know whether Dash, Nu, or Azalea is going to be legal. For their nationals, and I'd love to ask you again, but again, you're not playing Australian nationals, so now I'm kind of just like,
But okay, let's do it differently. Let's say that we get to the last week, and like Kano might be on the cusp before we go to Singapore of being legal or not legal, because of nationals.
Is Singapore? Wait,
2
is there
weeks.
nationals?
It's 2 weeks.
It's
It's 2 weeks after. It's 2 weeks after. It's 2 weeks after. So
Okay,
it's very close.
Yeah, that's still a very short lead time.
I think my view is still mostly the same. Is that I think it's something that I think is interesting and becomes a part of understanding metagames, prepping for eventualities or non-eventualities, and adapting to metagames. And I think now with where we are in Living Legend, it's clear there's a landscape of things will change week to week. So, and this can happen in the ProQuest season as well. Things can change week to week. Yes, the stakes are higher, right? As opposed to a local ProQuest, it's a nationals, potentially Singapore, with 2 weeks between the last nationals and Singapore. But I'm here for it. Like, I think it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be difficult for some players for sure. Like, I think the one that's probably going to throw the most wrenches in people's plans is probably Nu. I think that's a real, people might be prepping for nationals next weekend right now. First weekend of full non-US nationals, planning to play Nu at this point. And if Nu wins the calling, or US Nationals this weekend, it will not be legal next weekend, and that is definitely going to throw some wrenches in plans. So how do you prepare for that? You need to have that eventuality. You need to have that contingency plan of, one, what's it going to do to the meta when Nu does Living Legend this next week, and also, if I'm planning to play it, what's my fallback? Where am I going if I'm not playing Nu? And I think that's, to me, honestly, that's interesting to me. Like, if I'm playing Nationals next weekend, I'm sat there glued to US Nationals this weekend, working out what the meta is, and I'm honestly probably just focusing on what's a good, powerful deck right now. Like, I'm probably tuning up my Verdants, or I'm tuning up my Florian, or I'm saying, okay, if Nu does win this weekend, it's because the meta is probably like primed. It's probably a lot of Verdants out there. There's probably a lot of sort of mid-range and semi-aggressive decks. Not Syndra so much, but maybe things like Katsu show up, etc. Where am I going to go after that? So yeah.
It is important to point out, this is actually quite different since before London, because Zen was kind of
irrelevant.
It was, yeah,
to a degree.
I wouldn't use that strong a term. It was more of a wasn't really warping.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't gatekeeping anything. And there weren't things that were changing too much against it. That was like Vin said, I guess. I was like struggling because Zen was still around, but that was like about it. Nu is very, very different. Nu is a serious point in metagame. People are unable to play certain blues because of Nu's existence. I think I've been seeing a lot of gravy builds as well. They're like, we can't play blue, like this blue big boat or whatever, because Nu is still around. So she has a lot more of an impact. And I think, to your question about how do I feel, I mean, I'm going to echo similarly to what I felt before London, is that I think it's too short of a lead time for people to prepare for a high stakes event like this. I think if it was like something like a calling or whatever, it's exciting. It's calling on release weekend, like for Memphis, like okay, that's fun. But for nationals, for anything that's high stakes like nationals and PTs, and definitely not worlds, it feels too short. I think a lot of predict like what the meta is gonna be. It just comes down to luck, and I feel like when I'm watching a high stakes event, I want to see a lot more skill and a lot more. This came out of their prep rather than they managed to guess. and kind of get lucky with the prediction of the meta, because you really can't predict the meta, right? It's like now suddenly Guardians can play the big blues again, and like it's so hard to like understand the ripple effect that's gonna happen like across everything, and whether it even matters at all, right?
I actually just massively disagree with that. I think predicting meta and understanding meta shifts is like one of the most skill testing things about preparing for a Flesh and Blood event. And yes, it's on a much shorter lead time. I will grant you, like a week versus a month is a big difference in time. But I think calling it luck to get the meta right is, I think, not accurate personally. I think it really, sure, there's elements of it, and if you don't have a good handle on it, it might feel like, no, I'm just flipping a coin as to whether this is going to be the right decision or not. And there will be times where it's like, how will people react? And you've got to try and understand how people react. But I think like there's a lot of things that you can understand and you can knowingly get a handle on. So I'll use an example. We go to US Nationals this weekend. We're going to see a meta. We're going to see a meta start to develop. Whether New does or does not Living Legend, some of those, a big chunk of those decks are still going to be the popular decks. If New Living Legends this weekend, Florian's still going to be popular. Verdance is still going to be popular. You still have an understanding of what the meta is going to look like in some way, shape, or form, even though there will be responses and consequently responses to the responses next weekend.
I think I might put it a different way as well. I think the doing well at an event like that, when it's like a week after like a massive shakeup or something, ends up being a lot more about just catching people off guard. I think about Memphis, right? I think about the week of Memphis release, Hunter release, and the week after, where Syndra like won callings back to back, and then we never saw her again. That was just people like sort of the wins coming off the back of people not understanding Mask Momentum, Flick Knives, for example. Yep. Like a new interaction that's suddenly that people are just unprepared for, showing up, and then people getting advantage from that. And I feel like that sort of advantage or that sort of narrative is cool and exciting for a calling level, but not so exciting for a Pro Tour and a Worlds level. I'd rather see refined and preparation gameplay and not they caught off guard from interactions they hadn't fully practiced against, which I think is more likely the sort of thing that's going to happen when you LL a significant hero a week before.
But to your point, at the higher level should be able to respond to that, right? Like because you're equating a Nationals to a Pro Tour. I would equate a Nationals to a calling. They're both tier 3 events. So just to the point before about high stakes, I think Nationals is less high stakes than a Pro Tour or Worlds. I mean, the prize pool's less. It's a tier 3 event, not a tier 4 event. But if we're comparing the level of play, people should be able to respond to that. Like it blew me away how badly people were playing into Flick Knives. I'm like, play a couple of games. It doesn't take much to understand this. So I would say that's bad preparation from people not understanding what a meta could look like and not preparing for it.
Okay, fair enough.
I
appreciate. Go on.
I think it's very interesting. Like I do think that there's a conversation to be had about whether this is, like, to your point, like this is, and I'm probably leaning more into the devil's advocate on the side of like it being a good thing than I necessarily actually believe it is, because I do think there is a conversation to be had on whether this is good for the game. I will say it's at the very least interesting, and I'm interested to see how this plays out over the national season. And then what the feeling is from players and sort of generally after we go through this sort of shuffle of Living Legend over the next few weeks.
I will agree with you that it is interesting. I think
we can agree on that one.
But speaking of things that people might be not prepared for and new innovations and strategies that people should be prepared for, I think as we talk about the new meta, I think it might be good to start with the new heroes and where they've landed, and then we move on into existing top decks. So let's start with the new Necromancer. Have you been brewing much with Gravy Bones, or seeing much of it being played?
Yeah, I played a little bit with it. I haven't necessarily been brewing myself. I think what's interesting to me is I don't think I have incentive to be brewing with Gravy Bones right now, because I think a lot of people are doing so, and so I will see it this weekend. I think what I did is I gave myself a bit of a starting point of what I think is real about Gravy Bones and what isn't real, so that if I see things this weekend, I have a bit of at least rule of thumb of like, oh, that breaks what I thought my expectations were about this hero, or that doesn't break expectations, and actually I think that's maybe not the right avenue to go down, for instance. I think when it comes to Gravy Bones, I think what it looks like on the surface is not what this hero is. I think this hero is more akin to a value style deck, and I think people are trying to treat this like a like a combo board state deck, and I don't think that's what it is. So I actually think, honestly, as much as this is going to ruffle your feathers and annoy you, not because of what I say, just because of the comparison, if it is true, it will annoy you. I do think that there are some real comparisons between Gravy Bones and Enigma, to be honest.
I mean, I do think he's an illusionist, and so my feathers are already ruffled. So
Exactly.
you're spared ruffling my feathers, because I already do think he's basically the new illusionist. He's meta warping in the way an illusionist is. The very interesting thing, though. So firstly, I think a lot of people are building him wrong. I think especially early on, we saw him. People like 30 allies in the deck and they can't block anything, and then they just fall over and die. I think that sort of build is wrong. I think the more powerful builds I've been seeing are a little bit more akin to the value stuff that you're saying, but with board state tacked onto it, so it's very, very difficult to beat him on the value, and is quite resilient as well. So I think Enigma / Dromai are the parallels that sort of I'm getting a little bit when I see this. Dromai a little bit just because you kind of have to deal with the allies, and for many heroes, you lose because you just can't deal with the ally efficiently.
Yeah.
And unlike Dromai, you can't even pop them or anything. So that limpet that's there with 1 health, you need to send a whole card into it always, for example. So it's like in between Dromai and Enigma, where it was sort of value-based like Enigma, but the way to deal with it is very annoying, like Dromai was.
I think people are going to be punished for not being prepared for that this weekend. I think if Gravy Bones is real, and I think Gravy Bones is... I think it could catch people off guard. To your point before about catching people off guard by not understanding interactions, I think if you're not prepared to play into Gravy Bones, so for instance, you don't have some Go Again in your sideboard, you have ways to deal with these annoying allies. Because I think there's a couple of play patterns where you can almost semi-protect an ally because the opponent doesn't have the right cards in the deck to deal with an ally. It's a known quantity. So I pair into, let's say, a deck that wants to go a little bit taller, or a deck that, like, so if I play into Nu, for instance, I think if players playing, Nu's based on, sorry, if I'm playing into Marionette, for example, and their play pattern is like, dagger plus tall attack on a stealth attack to cause you issues. If they don't have ways to send in between attacks to clear allies, I think that they're going to get significantly punished. But if they have understood this and prepped with, say, 6 cards in their sideboard, or maybe a slightly different game plan into how they want to play into it with some Go Again, then they won't get punished. For instance, if they're like, okay, well, I'm definitely playing Scar Tissue because then I can make sure a dagger can clear these potential pesky allies. Things like this. I think this is what's going to be the test this weekend.
Also, lots of interactions on the Gravy side, which you just need to play against to just get a feel for how to play against it. Chum and Sawbones are the two that come to mind the most for me, where the Sawbones like preventing one and the Chum is like forcing you to attack it. If you rely too much, if you're like, oh, I'll pump my thing and then send it, well, you play a pump, and then they discard Chum. Now you have to attack the Chum instead of attacking face or attacking something else. And then the Sawbones stopping your dagger on hits if you're like trying to rely on it, if you're Nu or Marionette, example. There's just lots of things where you just need reps into it and get a feel. Great. In terms of spot in the meta, I think the super weird thing about Gravy is that I think he's a meta warping force. I think once the builds coalesce, I think he's a meta warping force. But the builds haven't coalesced yet. So he's not actually having the impact on the meta yet. So I imagine... So he has a tough time into Ninja. Like, he has a tough time into Syndra, as kind of everyone expected. But I don't expect Syndra to do super well right now because people haven't fully grasped that Gravy is like a force.
Yeah.
So he's about to be meta warping, but we haven't gotten there yet. So I expect him to do well now. But in the future, if people adapt, we'll have to see.
Can I just go back on one thing? That also, this is a parallel and draw between our previous conversation. Obviously, we had some disagreement on, rapidly living legend and what that might mean for people being able to, adapt to a format. And one element we didn't speak about, which I think is a given, is obviously if players are prepping to play a deck and then all of a sudden their heroes hit living legend, they can no longer play it. I think that is the part that I feel less comfortable with. The development of the meta and responding to the meta, I think, is the part I feel passionately is good for the game. And here's an example right here. Gravy Bones shows up this weekend. How do you adapt before next weekend? Or I'll push it one even further. You already understand what Gravy Bones can do in a format, and you've already prepped for that eventuality, and you're ahead of that. Or we see Gravy Bones show up this weekend and really punish people for not having the right builds of decks, but you've already been working on Syndra this week in anticipation of Gravy Bones being a good deck that people then adapt to in the second week. And I think, to your point, that is what we will see. I think I'm so on Gravy Bones, whether people come to the right builds, but also how the Gravy Bones play. Do they have enough time? Like, I think a big thing right now is people are like, I'm just going to fatigue Gravy Bones. That's my plan right now. I'm just going to run them out of allies, run them out of damage. And I think that is a plan. Will it work? Depends on how prepped the Gravy Bones players are, I think. So there's just so many questions I have in relation to Gravy Bones for this weekend, and it doesn't just rely on just the Gravy Bones players, it relies on everyone in terms of how they respond. So yeah, I think ultimately Gravy Bones will shake out to be good. Like you say, I think it will be warping in some degree in terms of the way it makes people forced to interact with him. Will it be tier 1? I don't know. I'm not sold on that yet.
It's very Illusionist-esque, where it is on the Gravy Bones players to pilot it well, but it's also very much on the opposing side to understand threat density. And this happens every time there's a new Illusionist. The idea of threat density, just you have to learn it specifically against that hero specifically. Like OG Prism, it's like the Spectra is super important, but new Prism, Genesis isn't as important as it was in OG Prism. But people, if you adopt the same threat density as OG Prism, you actually might end up getting punished for it. And in certain angels, knowing which one's the actual important one versus not. And also in relation to the amount of soul they have, for example. And in Dromai, the whole dragon thing, obviously knowing the difference between a Chromine and Asvabai, for example, was a whole threat density thing you had to come to terms with that only came with a bunch of practice. And I think people need that into Gravy Bones as well as the Gravies themselves understanding how to pilot the hero to max effectiveness and to max value.
Yep. What about Marlin? Let's get through these new heroes, and then I want to talk about probably top down of what we think the potential best decks after the weekend and go down a bit of a list. Before we end with a bit of a meta call, I want to try and make a bit of meta prediction this weekend and see where we think the first week of the format's going to shake out. Tell me about Marlin. What do you think about Marlin? Is Marlin legit? Is this a competitor for national season?
So I think just overall take about all three of these heroes, Marlin, Puffin, and Gravy Bones, is that right off the bat, they are, I think, some of the deepest and most complicated heroes we have seen in CC in a while. They are. I think it's probably also partly because they're coming, at least in the case of Marlin and Puffin, they're coming into established card pools as well. Whereas, previously, when you had a couple of mechanologists or whatever, it's like there isn't that deep of a card pool. But now Marlin and Puffin are coming in and there's established ranger and established mechanologist card pools. So it's really, really difficult to fully grasp how good certain cards are, whether you need certain cards. And for me in Marlin, a big one is actually 3 of a kind, and specifically Cannon Marlin. I went ahead of myself a little bit. I think there's Cannon Marlin and there's Death Dealer Marlin that exists right now. Death Dealer, obviously, while Azalea is still around. And it's very... I think it's tough to know which one's better. I mean, Death Dealer Marlin has more explosive lines, for sure, but then it's kind of an aggro deck. I'm not entirely sure if it's the best aggro deck out there. 3 of a kind is amazing in that deck, for sure. In Cannon Marlin, 3 of a kind is I think, starting to become a little bit of a question. I'm not going to say you should or shouldn't, because I haven't solved the question myself. It's very much a question. There's certain super strong plays. You do it, now you have enough resources to activate your cannon, send a massive harpoon. But it asks a lot in your deck building. It asks you have a certain ratio of arrows, and a lot of those arrows will be like mopey blue arrows you might not necessarily be happy sending. So then you have to ask yourself, is 3 of a kind worth needing to run all the other stuff, or should you maybe instead run some of the pirate boats instead? And that's what I mean by these heroes are just incredibly complex and deep. I'm also not fully certain what the best use case for gold in Marlin is. Is it actually just an anti-fatigue tool potentially? Or are you actually just making harpoons to discard to your cards that care about discarding yellows? Or are you playing like harpoon pumps and then actually trying to overpower and actually finish the game with gold and harpoons? So lots of questions I think yet to be answered by Marlin. To come back and answer you to give you a little bit more of a definite answer, I think she is strong. I don't expect her to have a big break this weekend because I think lots of questions. There needs to be a lot more brewing, a lot more understanding of the deck, and also specifically because she's a ranger, also specifically with relation to the meta. I could see a lot of Marlin's deck building revolving around what she's trying to beat, and we're sort of a little too open right now for me to expect Marlin to do well.
I want to talk a little bit about Puffin. Puffin's a hero that last week I spent...
You go. Your turn to monologue.
Bit of time sort of brewing. I think I'm always really interested when a hero ability says draw a card. I am drawn to power inherently. I think that's what I look for in Flesh and Blood, especially when I'm brewing and trying to build decks, is just raw power. And I think that's what Puffin's hero ability represents. I think upon sort of like diving in and trying to work out what Puffin could look like, the challenge is that Puffin is getting pulled in a lot of different directions, and the ability to effectively use your hero ability with some power, with payoff. And I think the challenge comes in the fact that a lot of, or almost all the previous Mechanologist cards are so heavily tied to boost. And now this changes, right, with Crank. And we've seen, of course, we saw Crank in Bright Lights, and Crank does exist. But, the payoffs aren't necessarily there for Crank, I think is the tough thing. And so I think Puffin has a spot as a potentially reasonable, aggressive deck. And I think it's actually, I think it can be pretty powerful. My question becomes, at that point, is Dash IO just a better shell? Maybe even Dash IE, because of the cards you get to run, like Teklo Core, like Spark of Genius, and these cards are very, very powerful. So I think some big question marks around Puffin for me right now. I think there is, potential mid-range elements, but I'm not sure that there is, quite the right level of support in Mechanologists that aren't boost. And yes, you can run Pirate, you can run Generic, but I think it's probably missing still a piece when it comes to that. So to be honest, for me, it feels like Gravy Bones is the most out the door potential. I think Gravy Bones sits around a tier 1 to tier 2 deck potentially over the next couple of weeks. Marlin, I think, while Death Dealer is around, I think can sit. I honestly think Azalea is probably just better up front. I think Marlin gets more interesting once Azalea goes, but of course, Death Dealer Marlin, I think, is also a real threat. So I think it sits somewhere around the tier 2 for me at the moment. And then Puffin is like the one where I'm like, this could be busted. Like, it has this crazy hero ability, but it just isn't quite coming together right now, and maybe someone can piece it all together. So Puffin's the biggest question mark for me, but I think it's probably going to fall into somewhere around like the tier 2 to tier 3 mark potentially, unless someone is able to break that hero ability.
You mentioned Puffin being pulled in a lot of different directions, and that's kind of how I feel about Marlin as well, where she wants these heavy resource cards, which means you feel like you want to run the pirate cards that care about like High Tide and stuff, but then that conflicts with like Three of a Kinds and the whole arrow stuff that she also wants going on, especially if we're playing the cannon build. So I'm not ready to write her off just yet. I just think it'll just require a lot more fine-tuning than maybe some other heroes that we've seen released, where like you sort of know how they should be built when they come out. Puffin, honestly, I feel like the strongest thing about Puffin is Polycranker. Like, I don't write Puffin off either, and my main reason is Polycranker. And I definitely agree with you on the boost thing, because boost as an archetype, as the mechanic, feels like it's strongest when you have multiple boost cards. Yeah. Like, I think about some of the strongest boost cards, Pulse Wave Harpoon, right? That's like the strongest boost card. It's only good if you've also boosted a whole bunch.
Maximum Velocity.
You mentioned Sparker... Yeah, Maximum Velocity. You mentioned Sparker Genius, which obviously Puffin can't play, but the idea of boost is that it feels like it rewards you for boosting more. And so unless your whole deck is boost, then I don't fully see that mechanic maybe having the payoff that you want. Maybe it unbrick some hands. I could see like 0 to 60 maybe just finding a play just because it's an aggro card. But other than that, I just feel like the Polycranker stuff, Polycranker in particular, is the reason I struggled to write off Puffin just yet, but I haven't done much of my own brewing, so
I think all three of
we'll have to see.
All three of the heroes have power, and like you say, they're super deep. So I think it's as much as we can talk through this right now, I just don't think we can come to a definitive answer or even close to, because these heroes are so complex. I think it's not like sitting down with heavy hitters and being like, you know what, I can make a call about Olympia, KO, and Victor pretty early on in terms of where I think they're going to sit in the meta. That was, I think, pretty easy to do. I think this is very different. So, yeah. I want to talk about...
And they are...
Oh, you go.
I just want to say, they are, because of that, very fun to deck build and play, to be honest.
And
like,
frustrating.
The number of branching decisions... Just gold, and frustrating too. Just gold by itself. I'm sitting with Marlin, I have like 2 gold up, and I'm holding like cards in the Three of a Kind, and there's just so many branching paths, and you have to think about what happens when you draw, like, what if you draw this off the gold, what if you draw that off a gold, and just doing that whole little, like permutation stuff is very fun, and when it gets paid off, it's very, very satisfying. So I found the heroes very, very fun, while at the same time complex, and to your point, maybe sometimes frustrating too.
I want to talk through some of the existing heroes in the format, of course, in light of changes, but also this new format, and just touch on each of them briefly in terms of whether we think they are, top tier contender, whether they are an interesting option, or whether we think they are just not real. I think it's probably the 3 buckets I would put them into, and I want to start with the Earth heroes. And I want to start with Verdance, because I think Verdance is a real big winner of potential changes and also high seas and recent Living Legends. particularly with like Aurora and stuff hitting Living Legend. I think Verdance arguably might be the best deck heading into this weekend, which is crazy to think. 6 weeks ago, Pankaj was saying, I think this deck's bad. Well, you were flip-flopping between in the lead up to London of whether you thought this deck was super exciting and really good or a little bit of a pipe dream. But I think Verdance is potentially, the best deck heading into this weekend.
I would have agreed if it weren't for Gravy, actually. I think the Gravy Verdance matchup is quite rough for Verdance.
It makes sense.
Again, when the Gravy is built well. But I will agree with you that I think her spot has gone up quite a bit. Like, the bans helped her quite a bit because the lack of CYB also means that Verdance can sort of move away from having a full dedicated combo.
Yeah.
Jury is out on whether she just needs it in the mirror. But against every other deck, you kind of don't need to do the 3 H-bot full Aethertide stuff. And anyway, that combo also got a little bit worse because of the existence of Arcane Compliance. Now you kind of... Because of Arcane Compliance, you typically want to have your Verdance amp go onto a Verdance ping rather than a card, so that you don't get blown out by Arcane Compliance. Like, you can't Arcane Compliance a Verdance ping. You can only Arcane Compliance like an Arcane damage card.
Yeah.
So that makes the whole Aethertide thing... It's a consideration for Aethertide thing as well. So yeah, that and Florian being hit is good for Verdance. Of course, unless Nu also props up a little bit, that could affect Verdance's... spot as well, but I'm definitely with you that I think the lack of a really, really strong aggro deck, like the reason I was flip-flopping a lot before London was because Aurora existed and would a well-potted Aurora it felt so rough of Verdance. But now the best aggro deck is like Syndra, which is still good. I wouldn't say I'm like super happy to play against Syndra as Verdance, but it's a lot better than like Aurora. And then Florian getting hit and everything. So yeah, I'm definitely with you that Verdance feels to be in a strong spot. Now, you as a Florian aficionado, where you at with this hero?
Yeah, I want to come back to something that you said, which do you think Syndra is the best aggro deck? Because I have a contention to that a little bit further down the list. The other piece I might say about that's directly related to Florian is I think Florian is a pretty good aggressive deck and might just be a better option, a more robust aggressive deck. The problem is if you're trying to target potentially Gravy Bones and even Verdance, right? Maybe Syndra is actually an option. We'll get down to that that part when it comes to Ninja. I think Florian, despite the hits, I think it had to be done. I think Florian was by far and away shaping up to be the best deck in the format. I think Verdance was going to be the challenge for it. Everything else potentially not a challenge with the setup it could have. I think now though, there's some real interesting questions about how you build Florian, what it looks like into certain heroes like Verdance, for instance, like Gravy Bones, like the aggressive decks like Syndra potentially. The Assassins, I think, becomes a much more interesting matchup now, whereas opposed to before it was not an interesting matchup. So, yeah, I think Florian, big changes. I think what's going to be interesting to me is I think Florian is... it almost takes me back to where Florian was pre-London, honestly. That's actually where I feel Florian is, somewhere between that and... So it feels like it's shaking out around this kind of like top tier, but it has a lot of questions that need to be answered, and you have to build it in certain ways, which might cause you weaknesses to certain heroes. You can't just build a pure stack build anymore, for instance. So I think Channel Mount Heroic comes back into the picture. I think potential lots of Go Again comes back into the picture. That's going to help you against Gravy. That's also going to help you against Florian to be more aggressive as well. Against Verdance to be more aggressive. So I think actually Florian might start to turn into more of this attacking aggressive deck in the next couple of weeks, and that's interesting. We're going to see this shift. We actually started to see that shift at the end of ProQuest season as well. People going back to things like Channel Mount Heroic. So
I actually think the new Florian matchup was an interesting matchup even pre-ban. You might disagree, but I actually thought that matchup had a lot of interplay on both sides. And now I actually think new is just... Well, it depends, again, how Florian pivots. But I think if Florian does pivot into the more Channel Mount Heroic stuff, that actually is better for new, since that is just a little bit more disruptible. But I'm definitely with you that I think the Go Again Florian stuff is looking to be interesting, almost like a Briar cosplay, right? Where you're based around Channel Mount Heroic, and after you play Swarming Gloom Veils and you play Rune Rager Swarms and stuff. There is an interesting thing. I kind of just theoried it when I saw the card. Haven't brewed with it at all. I'm just gonna put it out there. We have budget belittle now in the form of Nim.
Very budget.
And Nimblism.
Very Wish.com.
Very budget. But Florian does have Spellbound Creepers, which feels like the best home for a tutorable Nimblism, just like how Briar tutored Minuism. Of course, Briar also had Embodiments of Lightning, so maybe it's a full Pipe Dream or whatever. But if you're going down the whole go again, if you're trying to do the whole go again stuff, I do wonder whether I think it's worth at least trying out and then writing it off, just because I think Belittle Briar was a very, very strong deck, and this is kind of the closest thing we have. If you're already trying to do a Briar cosplay with Chalmont Heroic, it's like, why not just try this, right?
Yeah, I don't disagree. Why not? Yeah, go one step further. Let's talk about some other groups of heroes. We spoke about Marlin already, but let's just close out on Ranger. Azalea? Is it good?
So I think the Ranger's classically just the Ranger identity is a little similar to Assassin in that you kind of need to know what is going on everywhere else to understand how to build your deck the best and how well positioned you are. Like if you tell me Florins are moving into full aggro or like, you know, very, very aggressive leaning, then I could see Azalea being decent. But if you tell me Florins are maybe doubling down and somehow going into more defensive stuff, like doing Rites of Replenishment, Everbloom stuff, then I would struggle with Azalea. So it's a bit of a question mark with how everything else lands, is my current take. Do you feel differently?
Yeah, I actually think Azalea is potentially a very good proactive deck for this first 2 weeks of Nationals, depending on if it, of course, just takes out an event this weekend anyway. But I think, so I go back to the Dromai meta. And Azalea actually had a really good matchup into Dromai once that was tuned to be able to do so. You've got the Bolton shots, you've got all these ways. So I think, you know, Gravy's not really a concern for Azalea. Honestly, I don't actually like. It's not. I don't think it'll be an easy matchup, but I don't think it's actually that much of a concern like other illusionists have maybe been because of the ally piece of it.
Well, except Chum. I do feel like Chum probably poses quite a bit of a problem for Azalea. Like as a deck that wants to give a whole bunch of priority windows and then send one big thing outside of the Bolton shot turns that you're talking about.
So I'm not sure that Azalea does want to send one, like just one big turn anymore. That's kind of my point. I think you're building it in a way probably like it might be a 9 Bolton shot deck, honestly. You've got some new arrows, of course, as well. Like you've got Swift Shot now as well, which I think is very impactful. So I think it might look quite different, but I think there's quite an aggressive Azalea deck to be had that I think might be really good this week. I think it's going to be good into the other aggressive decks. I think that kind of go wider mentality potentially helps you into like Mario. You can kind of, I think, be able to flex in between as well, between like a taller deck and a wider deck, and I think that's what they'll try and do depending on the matchup. So I don't know. I think Azalea honestly could surprise and be one of the best decks for this one weekend, maybe a second weekend before it hits LL, is my view. Let's talk about the Assassins.
Assassins?
Yeah.
I was thinking Assassins, the next bucket. Now, I think you mentioned you have like Verdance as your potential best pick. I think it's either Nu or Mario for me. I actually think the Assassins are in a very, very good spot now, post Florin being hit. Stuff that seems to be coming up. Okay, again, caveat on Gravy. Like, I don't think either of them has a very, very good time into Gravy in particular, but like of the other existing stuff, like I think Verdance is fine for Nu. Florin got a lot better. And if people want to play ranges and stuff, I actually think Nu is very fine into that as well.
Yeah, I've played some more Mario again recently. I actually played a lot of Mario now over the past, like since it was released actually. I just, fundamentally, something just isn't clicking for me with this hero. It just continues to feel slightly clunky. It feels like as soon as, maybe it's because I played so much of it. Every time I play into it, I'm like, well, I know exactly what you're going to do. And it feels quite easy to play into now. And I don't know. I know people have, they've tweaked builds, they've focused more on daggers and things like this. The dagger costs 2. And I just, the mark aspect, it all just continues to feel a little bit too awkward for me to be as powerful as I want it to be.
So I'll correct you slightly on the dagger costing too. A big part of the dagger build is to, as soon as possible, get into
Graphene.
A Clave
Yeah.
setup.
Yeah.
Which helps a lot.
It does. One blue.
Also the Clarissa.
Yeah.
And Clarissa is very difficult to block as well because stealth dagger, so Tarantula Toxin. And you might be like, why would I ever block it? Well, because sometimes it's buffed up. And the other times is because if they're flipped, you can pump the Clarissa with your Arachne hero ability. Like, say there's a Funnel Web or a Black Widow on it or whatever. You can actually get that effect as well. So I think that whole combination is very, very tricksy.
I agree.
Helps with
it's
the
tricksy.
Dagger resource cost. And it helps with the resource cost thing that you're talking about.
It's tricksy. It does improve the resource cost. Still just doesn't quite feel right. You've got to get there.
I think it's wrong.
You've got to get there to start with, which is the first thing, is you've actually got to find that. And it feels different whether you do that on turn 2 or you do that on turn 4. I think that feels quite significantly different.
Well, they play like 6 of the Orb Weaver Spinnerets, and then they can also flip into Spinneret. It's not that inconsistent to get it pretty early on in the game. And I think as far as Assassins go, I would give Nu's matchup spread overall, like across the field, better than Mario's. But I think Mario is better into Nu rather than...
Sure.
I think Mario is slightly favored into Nu. So that's kind of where they get an edge compared to Nu, where the rest of the matchup spread might be a little bit worse, but then into Nu, it's like I think you'd rather be on the Mario side. My pick is I think the Assassin's going to do well this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to it. I just feel like the thing with Mario I keep coming back to is it just continues to feel like a very similar conversation I've had with Leviathan players before, where they're like, no, what you don't understand is this, and I'm like, yeah, no, I get that. I've played it, but it still doesn't work. Like, I don't know. And I think it's better than Leviathan, don't get me wrong. I think Marionette is better than Leviathan. I think it has more consistency, which I think is really important. But yeah, just every time I play it, and I think I have a breakthrough with this hero, or I see something new, I'm like, oh wow, let's play this. And then like 2 or 3 games down the track, I'm like, I still have the same issue with like some of the play patterns in this deck, and some of the power level of the payoffs, and not seeing certain cards. Like I'd say the games where I flip into like Graphene early, yeah, I agree. Like if I do it on turn 1 or turn 2, it feels very different to doing it even on turn 3 or turn 4. Like I think they're both early, but I think even, against certain decks, for instance, playing as Florian, a turn of difference can mean a Channel Mount Heroic turn plus a CNC, right? It can be a big world of difference. Or against Verdance, it could be the difference between they've decomposed or not and being able to felling me to take me off of potential tempo. And then I think the other piece of it as well is the difference between just like if I draw Saber Bloodshed or not on some of those turns. Like the difference between seeing Saber Bloodshed and not seeing it is friggin' massive. Yeah, I don't know.
Saber Bloodshed, yeah. Saber Bloodshed and Kiss of Death, I think, are 2 cards where the difference between seeing them and not seeing it is very, very big. Speaking of Assassins, there is one that we haven't talked about yet, Slippy. Especially if... Okay, I have no idea what Slippy's matchup into Gravy is going to be like, but I theorize it's going to be fairly decent, like how Slippy was good into Enigma. In which case, I do wonder whether Slippy is part of the conversation as well, because actually Slippy into Nu, at least the current builds of Nu, is actually very okay as well. Slippy into Mario is where, okay, you're a little bit sad to be on the Slippy side. But into Nu, you're fine, and into Gravy, you're fine. The question is the Earth Heroes. Can your Slippy be fine into Earth Heroes? I think that's a big question mark you'll have to solve. But I wouldn't be too surprised. It's a bit lower on my list compared to the other Assassins. But I wouldn't be too surprised if I see a Slippy doing decently as well.
I would be. But that's fine. I think Slippy is not a very good hero. But, I mean, people do well with all sorts of things, right? Leviathan top-aided Amsterdam. So, I don't know. Like, that's the thing is, you can pick things and there will be someone will have the miracle run, right? Like, someone will pick a deck, they'll get the right matchups, the things will go their way. They'll create Graphene on turn 1 or 2 every game. They'll find their Save Their Bloodsheds and Kids of Death, and they will make a run to top 8. Like, these things happen, right? I think I'm going to always talk to what I think are the most powerful and consistent things, and for me right now, I have some real question marks when it comes to all of the Assassins not named Nu, honestly, when it comes to consistency in this current format. So,
well, speaking of running hot and miracles, let's move on to talk about the hero that fishes the most off the top of the deck and wins or loses based on it. Let's talk about Kano.
Yeah.
Where you at with this hero?
I got a bit of a hot take. I think Arcane Compliance is just snag, honestly. And I think that it's all this hype around what Arcane Compliance does against Verdance and Kano. And then once you play with it a few times, you realize that actually this card is kind of whatever. And good players understand how to make use the fact that you've got this shitty blue instant in your deck and punish you for it. So I actually think Arcane Compliance is kind of a little bit of like a potential psyop for this weekend and next weekend in terms of what that card may or may not do in the format. I think it's kind of whatever. And I think Wizard is in a very good spot. I think Verdance is in a very good spot. And I think Kano is in a very good spot as well, because I think Kano is particularly good into the Earth Heroes. I think, the question mark is going to be Gravy Bones, right? What can Kano do in terms of that? But I think, into Nu, into Ranger, like I think Kano is potentially in a very good spot coming into this weekend. Kano is in a good spot.
So I agree with the Arcane Compliance into Verdance for sure, but that's because Verdance also has Plow Under to get rid of it for you, and then also can put the amp on a ping, which you can't Arcane 100%. Compliance. Tell me about why you like. Yes, I do agree with you. It's not the be-all, end-all solves the matchup the way people may think it is. But I do think it is somewhat decent into Kano, and I think Kano players do need to respect it and it does hurt them if the opponent has some numbers of arcane compliance on their deck. Do you feel differently? Or
No, I don't feel differently.
like I'm curious about your take. Okay.
I don't feel differently. I think that's very true, but it's not. It's not game breaking, and
Yes,
it's not.
It doesn't make you win 100%.
It's not matchup defining.
Yes,
I think that card comes at a cost. It's a blue instant that is very easy to like. Where it's gonna feel the most bad is where you kind of like flush out an arcane compliance, or you feel it out. Or you see them play something from Arsenal, and then they draw up next turn. They just draw the arcane compliance when you go for it. Like that's going to be the feels bad, and that's going to happen some number of time, and that's where it is going to have impact. But that's going to be offset by the times where these decks are being punished for having to put this in their deck. So yeah, it's going to have an impact for sure, but I think it's nowhere near as much an impact as people think. And I think already, it's like you say, Verdance. It's actually not that impactful against Verdance. It does have more impact against Kano, but yeah, I think there's play to it for sure.
Cool. I have a question for you, Hayden. Do we have an aggro deck? What do you think is the aggro deck of this format?
Yeah.
Well, actually, first, is there an aggro deck of this format? If there is, which one is it?
So I think that's a massive question. I think that's what players have to try and understand is what is the aggro deck in this format. I actually genuinely think the most represented aggro deck this weekend is probably going to be like Florian. I think like aggressive, like that's what's going to take the slot, like a Florian or an Assassin. I think that, so whether it be Slippy or even even Mario to an extent, I think is the deck that puts pressure on and asks questions. Azalea, I think it's going to be split basically of like you're going to see aggressive decks, but they're all aggro with a flavor. They're all aggro with an angle. So Azalea's is with on hit effects that disrupt attack actions and what the opponent's going to do. I think if you look at Mario or Slippy, like again, it's disruption to the hand or the arsenal. That's what they're looking to do. If you're looking at something like a Syndra, they're doing it because of Mask of Momentum. I think that's the more traditional aggressive deck, right? But they're going to lean into Mask of Momentum for the Gravy Bones matchup. I think Dash IO is interesting as well. I think some people might show up with Dash IO for just a pure output deck. But the one that actually I think no one's talking about and I have some interest in is KO. I think KO was like the premier aggro deck of a format a year and a bit ago when we went to Pro Tour LA. Obviously, it quickly got flushed out by Partha Veil, and then Aurora came in Rosetta. But KO is powerful, and I think as well the fact that KO can kind of flex into taking turns to do things like cast bones. I think you can have plans into Assassin, for instance, with that hero. I think becomes interesting to me. And I think actually, if you're looking for an aggro deck that can deal with Gravy Bones allies by just playing an attack on the first chain link and clearing an ally, and then still having damage for the rest of the turn, wild ride into whatever. I think it's quite interesting to me actually.
Okay. I mean, I think KO is favored into new to begin with. So, yeah, I think game into Assassin, I'm definitely with you on that front. The Earth Heroes, I think, a little bit of a problem. Again, it's a little tough to tell because of how much Florian has changed, but at least, as in from the bans, or if he has changed much. But pre-ban, I think that's a miserable matchup for KO.
Oh, yeah.
KO just loses that.
For sure.
It's so hard.
I think it's changed, though.
So, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if the Earth matchups have been fixed with Florian having that banned. So I'm gonna hesitate a little bit on KO.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying KO is the best. I'm not saying KO is the best aggro deck. I'm saying it's interesting, and I haven't heard people talking about it. I thought I might have. I actually, if I think the best aggro deck right now, my feeling is Azalea is the best aggro deck for this weekend.
Okay, that's fair. Okay. I have the Dash IO piece. I'm curious about. I still think I just don't think there's a solution for the full fatigue. Maybe I mean there is the new Majestic, right? I forget what it's called, but one that makes 2 cogs and goes to the bottom of your deck.
Yeah, cog in the machine.
It does mean, cog in the machine. Hang on, am I misunderstanding Symbiosis Shot? It does mean there's infinite Symbiosis Shot now, right? You can't, as long as she can keep resolving that card, she can always have Symbiosis Shot counters.
Symbiosis Shot is.
Or am I misunderstanding?
No, I don't think triggers with tokens.
Oh, okay.
So Symbiosis Shot is when a Mechnologist item enters the arena. Oh, maybe it does.
So it does, right?
I feel like it wasn't working properly in Talishar.
Yeah, it's Mechnologist item, and I believe the golden cogs are Mechnologist items. So in which case, now at least
that would work.
If that works the way I expect it to, at least in some form.
You got some way around fatigue potentially.
in some way, at least your Symbiosis shot can always be refilled if you expect yourself to be in that matchup. Well, it's also really weird because of boost and everything. If you boost it away, then obviously you can't anymore. So you need some way to like kind of keep it in your deck. But
I also just don't think it's enough.
Just pointing out,
I just don't think it's enough. Like you just get down to the end,
it's
like
probably
2
not.
damage each turn is whatever, or 4 damage each turn.
Yeah, well, yeah. So not entirely sure about that. But for me, I think Syndra is the sort of most vanilla clear aggro deck that I think potentially has a spot. Yeah, especially if people do show up with Gravy. And then I'm going to add another caveat where I think if Puffin gets solved, I could see Puffin having a wave as well. But I think we might have heard something about Puffin by now, if there was something. But again, this is similar to like last year US Nats, right? Like we didn't quite know Zen's power level until US Nats happened. Like we had rumblings of it going on. And who knows, maybe something that happens with Puffin, where Puffin shows up and everyone's like, oh, wait, this deck is busted.
Maybe. I think that kind of covers everything I want to speak about. Guardian is, in theory, interesting, but then it's actually not because Earth exists and also Wizards exist. So I think Guardian is...
And Nu still exists.
Yeah, I just think...
So Nu is still... Nu is warping the Guardian build so much right now. Like I think the Guardians, like I think they really want to go back to like Zealous Belting, Rouse the Ancient stuff, especially if Gravy shows up again. They just can't while Nu still exists. So
yeah, gotta wait till next weekend.
Just taking a bit of a back burner.
At least next weekend.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, I want to talk about just quickly potential meta for the weekend. Where do we think it's going to land? Small predictions. I can kick us off and then hand over to you, Pankaj. But I think Earth is going to be massively represented this weekend. I think Earth is going to be... I wouldn't be surprised if Earth is around 30% of the meta. Now, I always think that US Nationals, or Nationals in general, more akin to a calling. You're going to see a wider spread of heroes. It's not a Pro Tour, right? Pro Tour is where we see a bit more coalescence of heroes at the top. So I think 30% is a massive amount. That I think that is akin to like 45% of a Pro Tour meta, for instance, just to try and equate it to something at a Tier 4 event. So I think maybe it might be more around a quarter, 20 to 25% maybe of Earth decks, but I wouldn't be surprised to see as high as 30%. I think Verdance is that good. I think Florian is still very good, and they're known quantities. I think we're going to see a reasonable number of Assassins across Nu and Mario, and I think and Slippy actually a little bit. I think even combined, I wouldn't be surprised to see Assassin be sort of the second most represented behind those Earth decks. And then I think we are going to see Azalea. I think we're going to see Ranger come in, and Ninja in small amounts with Syndra, maybe a little bit of Katsu, and Gravy definitely. I think we'll see some Gravy, and I think a smattering of Guardian Cope, and that's kind of what I think the meta is going to look like this weekend.
It is tough to have this conversation of predicting US Nats meta without acknowledging at least the product issues stuff that's happening right now. But I think for that reason, I will say I don't expect that much from the new heroes, regardless of their power level. I think between Earth and the Assassins, I'm with you. I think in terms of buckets, those two will be the most represented. I feel like between Assassin and Earth heroes, I expect that to be half the field. I think 50% of the field is going to be a combination of Assassin and Earth heroes.
Wow.
I'm not entirely sure if I say 30% Earth, because I don't think Verdance has quite the same adoption rate, despite being strong. Yeah, so I could see Florence still being high. So I'm going to say the Earth heroes combined maybe are like 25%. Seems a little bit more right to me, with like Florence being like 15 and Verdance being 10, like sort of in that area. And then the Assassins being quite high. Like could Nu be the most represented deck?
Interesting.
Probably not, but I could see Nu being matched with Florian. I could see like Florian and Nu occupying the top two most represented decks.
I think it's going to be a lot more spread. Like I think it's really hard to call a most played deck, because I think it could be one of honestly 4 decks. I think it could be Florian, I think it could be Verdance, I think it could be Nu. I honestly think it could be Azalea. Like I actually think it's so interesting. We're going to see Kano in there as well, which we kind of spoke about. I think Kano could easily be the 6th most played deck, right? So, and I think the spread's going to be fairly flat around a lot of decks around that 8 to 12% mark. So yeah, I think it's going to be very fascinating, because the meta just it's week 1. It's so in theory open, and people are still working out things. A lot of things have changed. So yeah, on the product availability piece, I think obviously there will be... I don't know enough about currently where that sits in the US in terms of if people won't have access to cards come Friday, whether people couldn't pick up product on pre-release weekend as sort of promised, as you could sell product on the weekend. I know there were some availability concerns, whether people pre-ordered and won't get their pre-orders, for instance. But I think it sounds like a lot of people are going to be able to find the cards that they want to, especially honestly if Gravy is I think it's going to be Gravy, Arcane, Compliance. They're going to be the cards that people are looking for, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess people want to play Florian over it, and they also need Everbloom. I think there's some other
Yep. Good call.
expansion slot cards that people do need to get their hands on if they want to play those decks. But yeah.
Yep, good call. Cool. Well, that has been episode 216, not 116, Pankaj, 216 of Arsenal Pass. First look at High Seas Classic Constructed. Lots to play for this weekend. Calling coming up in Vegas alongside US Nationals, and that is going to kick off our national season where we expect to see some pretty rapid change from, I would say, really from week 2 is where you're going to start to see that change. Don't be surprised to see 2 to 3 heroes Living Legend in week 2. Potentially by the time we get to week 2 and 3, we could be as many as 4 or 5 heroes hitting Living Legend. That's maybe a little bit less likely, but by the time we get to nationals, end of national season, we could very well have 5 heroes hit Living Legend. So yeah, lots to happen in these next few weeks. We will be keeping on top of that, keeping you abreast of everything that's happening through this national season, talking about the meta as it unfolds and as we head to Pro Tour Singapore, of course. If you are playing nationals this weekend or heading to the calling in Vegas, best of luck. And until next week, we'll see you in the next episode.